We are now ready to start building this simulation. Let's jump inside our CityBlock sim that we put down in the previous video. Space G to home in on the file node that's there and remove it. We're going to put down two object merge nodes. One here. Copy that and paste it. These nodes will be where we're importing our buildings and city blocks. As such, let's name them appropriately. Let's call the left one import buildings and the right one import city blocks. Let's not forget to set the transform into this object so that whichever object we're importing is being transformed into this object. And we want to color them yellow because they are utility nodes, and that makes it easier for us to identify them as such. Now let's import these things. So instead of finding a node through the node finder, we're going to use an expression instead. So let's cancel that. I'm going to Alt-E this so that we get a bigger window. And I'm going to write an op expression. Op standing for operator, colon, 1 level up, 2 levels up, and we're going to go for the building clusters. And these are the clusters we've just made before. Now if we hit apply and accept, we should see that we have a cluster appearing in our window. Now if we go up 1 level back to object level and into the building clusters, we can see that it is exactly whichever one we have selected inside. So we've visualized out cluster and our switch node is set to number 2, and that's the cluster that we're importing now. If we would change this parameter, we would be importing a different cluster, and that's exactly what we'll be doing in future when we start automating the system. But for now, this is what we need. Let's go back to the CityBlock sim node and do the same for the import city blocks. Alt-E to make it bigger. Op colon up 1 level, up 2 levels, and then the node we're looking for is city blocks. And if we then again hit apply and accept, we see that we get one city block here. Let's also have a look inside that node. Let's go up and into the city blocks. And we can see that it is again just whatever we have visualized in here. Our blast node being set to block 1, 2, 3, 4. This is again a parameter that we can automate later on. Let's set it to 0, back to object level, and back into CityBlock Simulate. Now the plan for these two things is we have our buildings and we have our block. And what I want to do is transform this 2D block, which is just a surface, into a 3D object like a box. And then I'm going to see which buildings on the left side fit inside that box and cut away the ones that do not. For that, we need to unpack this node, because if we visualize the points, we can see that we only have one single point in the center as it is packed geometry. So let's go ahead and unpack this. In this case, we do not need to transfer these attributes because we are going to pull them in differently later. All we want now is to turn this into a box. Let's put down a poly extrude. Wire that into the left input, which is the geometry for operation, and visualize. So now we're going to have to give it a distance. The distance is going to be set to 10 in our case. I think that's a good value, and that will extrude it up by 10. Let's drop down a null node underneath our poly extrude. Let's wire that in. Let's color it yellow because it's not really an out node, but more like a utility that we're going to reference. Let's call it bbox underscore city block. So what I want to do now is drop down a group node and identify using this bounding box which buildings that we're pulling in on the left side actually fit inside. So let's drop down a group node. And if we look at the inputs, we can see that left gets the source data and right gets the bounding object. So the right goes into the bounding box for the city block and the left goes into our buildings. If we look at those, that's these. And if we then visualize group 1, we should be able to then make a group selection. First, let's call this inside city block. And then if we go into the group name and hit $OS, and then if we middle mouse, we can see that it takes the name that we gave the node, which I like to do for consistency. Since we're going to be selecting points, we want to set this entity to points. In the number tab, we want to turn off enable because we're going to be selecting them by the bounding box. That's that. And then in the bounding type, we want to say bounding object points only because that is the object that we're pulling in on the right-hand side. And now we should be able to see it in the viewport. Now let's examine that. We can't really see points because we're working with packed geometry. So that might actually be a problem. The reason for this is that we have not unpacked the buildings on the left. So if we would drop down another unpack node, on the left-hand side, we should get our points back. And now we can see that every corner of each building has a point. And then again, if we look at inside city block, we can see that the points that are inside it are lit with a slight blue circle around them. The ones that are outside are not. What we can do now is we can drop down another group node and we can inverse this selection. So we can say this group is not the other group. Let's wire that in, visualize it, and let's call it outside underscore block and $OS that again so that it takes the name of the node. So now the group and the node have the same name. If you middle mouse, you can see that reflected. Then if we turn off number and we go to the combine tab at the top, we can say this group $OS is not inside city block. And for that, we need to hit this button here. And now you can see if we select, so mouse click left on outside block, we can see that all the other points are now lit with the light blue circle around them instead of the ones inside the block. We can zoom out a bit and template the bounding box, and we can see that that is the case. So if we zoom in on the buildings inside, we see they are not lit, but the ones outside are. Right there. Now let's see what happens if we delete some things. So let's go back and drop down delete node. Let's wire up the outside block. And let's say that we want to delete the buildings that fall outside of it. So if we drop down all the way at the bottom of the list, we should find our groups, outside block, and we want to delete points because that's what we're working with. So now if we hit space G, we can see that we are deleting all the points outside of the block, but our buildings are not quite right in the sense that some corners get chopped off where others are kept inside. Now, if you'll join me in the next clip, we'll go ahead and fix this.